You might be wondering if it's ever okay not to use an observable property. And the answer is yeah, it is okay. But it really depends. There is more overhead in having an observable property as opposed to just a plain old property on an object. So there's activity between the source and the target. But is that activity enough for you to really worry about? Because after all, you want to be efficient. Well, let's talk about that. The question you should ask yourself is whether anything needs to react to your property changing. If it does, you're probably going to want an observable here. Places you may not need an observable is if you don't need to react to change, or you've got read-only data. Or perhaps you have one-time binding, meaning you want to get your data from some source and then bind it to the UI, but that's only going to be a one-time binding, again, probably for read-only data, or a list of items. And when you're loading a list of objects, if the objects themselves are not editable, then maybe you're just loading them into an observable array on the screen. You might not need an observable for all the objects inside that array. If the array itself is not going to change, you just want to load it once, and you're never going to add or remove from it either, that array does not need to be an observable array either. The reason for putting a list of items into an observable array as opposed to a regular JavaScript array is because you want it to show when things are added or removed in that array. You can also mix objects too. But let's say you're taking my advice and you really want to put some thought into what needs to be an observable or not on your object. Maybe you could mix the properties on your objects so some are observable and some are not. How will that turn out? Well, not all of them do need to be observable, so if we mix those, that's okay. For example, we can have an object here and a constructor for a person. We pass in the ID and the name and the age of that person. Then inside of there, we have an ID property which is not observable, but then we do have name and age that are observable. Now, why would we do this? Well, maybe the ID is not going to change. We want that one-time binding where we stick the value of ID in there, but we're never going to let that change. That might be like a primary key. But the other properties could be changed. So when we create that person object, we pass the values in. Everything works perfectly with our binding as long as we know that the ID is not going to change. In that case, there's no need for raising that event for property change. So mixing them up, that's okay. Now, if something needs to react to a change in one of these properties, such as ID, if the ID did change and you have a computed that's based upon that, you'd want ID to be observable. But what if we create a computed property, and that computed property is based upon two other properties? Like full name could be computed, and it's based upon first and last name properties. If first and last name are not observables, it's not going to update the computed full name when the first and last name change. So if we want that to be a computed that's truly changing based upon other property values, the computeds need to be based upon observables. So keep that in mind when you're deciding what needs to be observable. And if you're loading some kind of a read-only list into a grid on your UI, maybe you don't need those objects inside the array to be observable. So in this case, I'm just going to use plain old JavaScript objects, and then I'll wrap them inside of an observable array because I do want to know when things have been added or removed from the array itself in the UI. So we've talked about a couple different guidelines for helping you to decide when you should use observables or just standard properties. The first guideline is always consider what should be observable and what shouldn't be. If you have a lot of read-only data, or you don't have to react to changes to that data, maybe you don't need an observable. And while you put thought into that, I wouldn't get overly concerned about how many that you have, because you're not going to see a lot of overhead. It's generally very negligible when you're creating observables, but it's still wise just to make sure you're using them in the right places. But hopefully in this module, you've learned a lot of key tips on how observables work so you can make the decision for yourself.